110 Years of Weinstein Family History, Part 2. We can follow our story by looking at the April 1910 United States Census. We find the family has moved about 4 or 5 blocks from Rivington Street and are living at 7885 Clinton Street, still on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Mechel is now 43. Udall is 40. In April of 1910, although the ship's manifest says she was 42 in March of 1909. Malka is now called Molly and is 19, although the immigration document says she was 20. Peretz is now called Perry, is 18, same as he was at immigration. He should be 20. Fega is now Fanny, 9, and Yoilik is now Julian, 6 years old. Mechel and Udall have been married for 21 years. Hence we know they were married in about 1889. All in the family are recorded as born in Russia, as we know, but we learn from this questionnaire that Mechel and Udall's parents were also born in Russia. All but Udall are listed as speaking English, although I don't remember Mechel speaking English at all. Their occupations and where they work are listed as Mechel, twine maker, and works in a shop. Udall, occupation none. Molly, waist maker in a shop. Perry, twine maker in a shop. Fanny, none. Julian, none. So the older children are out working to help the family survive. In answer to the next question, had anyone missed work? None had missed any work in 1909. All could read and write. Fanny and Julian had attended school since September 1909, and they rented their home, not owned. Another column on the census form asks, mother of how many children? Number born, 4. Number living, she answers 4. This is interesting because we had always heard that Joe had a twin who died at some point, likely at birth because he is not in the earliest photo. We have one of Perry's engineering textbooks from Cooper Union. We discover from his inscription on the inside cover that he was in his 3rd year in 1913, so he must have started college in 1911. It confirms that he lived at 79 Clinton Street. He graduated from Cooper Union with a BS in civil engineering. His degree hung in the Brooklyn House hallway for many years and then was lost. He graduated in 1913 at the age of 23. We never figured out how he could learn English well enough in about 3 years to go to engineering college, and he spoke English with no accent. By the way, Molly always had an accent, but not Faye or Joe. Molly marries Jack Linschitz. The next event that we can trace in the records is the marriage of Molly to Jack Linschitz on January 21st, 1912. We find the record in the New York City bride's records for Manhattan and the groom's record with certificate number 2774, January 21st, 1912, in Manhattan. She was probably 22 years old. There is a photo of the Weinstein family with Jack at the time of their engagement, supplied by Enid in this video. There are photos of Jack and Molly and their 2 children, Bertha and Dave, who later became Dave Lind. We estimate these pictures are from about 1917, judging from the apparent ages of the children. From Molly's granddaughter, Enid Crease Marone, email. Molly had 3 children. Bertha Crease was the oldest, born September 27, 1912. Dave Lind, who was second, and a 3rd child, Lillian, who died of blood poisoning at the age of 4 as a result of a tonsillectomy. Jacob died at 39. We think the cause was leukemia. There is more about Molly's children later in this video. Another record we have is of Perry's naturalization petition dated June 9, 1914. Somehow the actual citizenship papers disappeared over the years. We also have a record of Perry's draft card from World War I from 1917-1918. He may have been exempt from the World War I draft, since during that time he worked as an engineer for the federal government in Washington. He also worked in Boston as perhaps the first Jew to work for an upper echelon engineering firm of Stone and Webster. Another event that we can document is Perry's second graduation, this time from City College on June 26, 1919. By that time, Perry had legally changed his name from Weinstein to Winston. Photos of that degree are on this video. He said he made the name change to avoid discrimination against the Jews. He said that the Weinstein name was too easy to pick out as Jewish on a job application or a civil service application. 10 years pass, and we come to the 14th census of the United States in 1920. The form questions have been slightly changed from 1910. The family is still living on Clinton Street. The address appears to be number 124. The census begins. Name each person whose place of abode on January 1st, 1920 was in this family. Mechel is now called Michael. Udall is still called Udall. Julian is still called Julian, but Fanny is now called Fay. Molly and Perry are not listed. Ages: Michael 51, Udall 50, Julian 17, Fay 19. Year of immigration: Michael 1905, the others 1909. Naturalized or alien: all are marked NA, which means naturalized. If naturalized, year of naturalization. Michael is marked 1910. However, the only Michael Weinstein we could find in the records is in 1925. Marital status: both children are single. Mother tongue: Yiddish for all. Able to speak English? Yes for all, although we know that Udall could not speak English. Finally, and most interesting, trade or profession or particular kind of work done. For Michael, proprietor. For Udall, none. For Julian, none. For Fay, stenographer. Industry or business establishment. For Michael, candy store. For Fay, export office. Employer or employee: Michael is marked OA, which means own account. He worked for himself. For Fay, W, which means an employee. 1921. Perry begins his career with the City of New York as a structural steel engineer and designer. He retired as the chief engineer for the Bureau of the Budget after 30 years. 1921. Fay and Frank Blackman. The same year, Fay married Frank Blackman on October 30th, 1921 in Kings County. That's Brooklyn. 1925, Perry and Sid Winston. On March 18th, 1925, Perry married Sadie, known as Sid, Goldstein, who was by then teaching in Public School 61 and still living on the east side of Manhattan. Sadie, in her family history tapes, says that when the wedding day approached, her sister Mamie had just died in childbirth and her father was sick, but Udall would not allow the wedding to be postponed. She said it was bad luck to do so. Sid always said her mother-in-law, Udall, wanted to get her old bachelor son Perry married off. Sadie was 24 and Perry was 33 years old. Sid Winston says on her autobiographical tapes that after they were married, she moved in with Perry. He must have had his own place since he was not listed with the family on the census. Sometime in the 1920s or early 1930s, Mechel and family moved to Coney Island, and Perry joined the Democratic Party and became friends with the famous political boss of Brooklyn and district leader Kenny Sutherland. In the following years, Kenny, as he was known in our family, was of great help to Perry in fending off the anti-Semitism that existed in the New York City government. Fay and Frank Blackman. Fay and Frank Blackman had twin daughters. They were born about the same year as Arthur Winston, 1926. They are named Shirley and Dorothy. Some childhood photos are in this video. Perry and Sid Winston had two sons. Arthur was born in 1926 and Richard in 1930. For a time, the Blackmans lived in the same house as the Winstons on 64th Street in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, in the early 1930s. Later, they moved to East 24th Street, Flatbush, a few blocks away from the Winstons, who were on East 26th Street. Richard remembers. I remember vaguely that the Blackmans lived upstairs in the two-family house on 64th Street in Brooklyn. There are pictures of Shirley and Dorothy and Richard and Arthur outside that house. I remember Cousin Dave lived there too for a while. I remember calling him for help one day when some kids were beating Arthur up on the street. There is more on Shirley and Dorothy later. The 1930 census. We have no 1930 census for Michael and Udall, but we do have that of Perry and Sid Winstone. The census taker wrote an extra letter E at the end of the Winston name. Those listed are Perry Winstone, Sadie is still called Sadie, Arthur, Richard, and Carrie Kungstead, a sleep-in maid who is listed as a servant. This is probably a word given in the census taker's instruction sheets. The census questions are a little different. The address is 2260 64th Street, Brooklyn. It's located between Bay Parkway and 23rd Avenue. Question is, does he own or rent? He says he owns, and the value of the house is $12,500. Next question, do they have a radio set in the home? Answer R for yes. For us, it's a funny question, but remember in those days, not only was there no TV, but radios were a new thing. Does this family live on a farm? No. Next questions. Sex, race, ages. Perry is 38. Sadie is 29. Arthur's 4. Richard is 2/12, meaning he's 2 months old. Carrie is 19. Occupations are listed as for Perry as engineer, working for the city of New York. In Sid's history tape, she says they bought the house brand new, probably in 1926, and it had a tax abatement for 10 years. With a tenant upstairs paying rent, it cost them $30 a month. They stayed in it until 1935. In 1930, Perry and Sid bought a summer bungalow in Long Beach and spent summers there for 30 years. In 1935, the Winstons moved to Flatbush, Brooklyn. This was during the Depression. The new house Perry bought cost $7,500, and the 64th Street house was listed on the 1930 census with a value of $12,500. He dropped that house to the bank and walked away from the unpaid mortgage, which you could legally do in those days. As a comment, if anybody doubts the value of owning real estate over the years, the 64th Street house, which Perry and Sid bought for $12,000 and was built in 1920s, is now, meaning this year in 2013, worth $750,000 on Zillow, the internet real estate site. The 1940 federal census finds Michael and Udall, now called Ida, living at 2313 Mermaid Avenue, Brooklyn. This is in the famous Coney Island and a place Richard and Arthur remembered. They owned the building, which was 3 stories. It had a store on the street level, and getting to their small apartment on the 2nd floor required the old folks to take the stairs. The building at the time is valued at $2,600 on the census. The photo in this video is recent, but back then the store was an ice cream and soda and candy shop run by the old folks. They are both marked as naturalized citizens on the census. One interesting fact is that to the question, where were they living 5 years earlier, meaning April 1st, 1935, the answer is the same place. Arthur remembers. The Weinstein's candy store ice cream parlor was in Coney Island. I dimly recall the candy store was named something like Perry's Ice Cream, and remember having some goodies there. Richard remembers. They must have sold the business at some point and didn't get along with the new owner, because I remember being sent to a competitor to get goodies around the corner. The old folks lived upstairs over the store. We were there on numerous Sundays to visit the grandparents, as was typical at the time. Mechel, Zeta as he was known, was a heavy smoker and drank tea over sugar cubes, Russian style. It will therefore be no surprise to find that at the end he was severely diabetic, and he had to have a leg amputated not long before his death due to the disease. He was also a heavy smoker and caused a fire in his bed by smoking there. Udall put out the fire by pouring buckets of water around him. Udall was very overweight and had a distinct limp and used a cane to walk. The cause of that problem is unknown to us. Remember, there were no hip replacements in those days. We have a few photos of them in this video. They spoke no English, and her surviving grandchildren remembers that Bubby Udall loved to play cards. Of course, we kids were subject to the folklore that Mechel was a bad, lazy businessman. I think Perry and the others really supported the old folks for some time, and I don't think that Sid Winston liked going to Coney Island to visit her in-laws on Sundays. Cousin Shirley's email. It seems like ages ago that all this took place. I do recall that Bubby lived with us for some time until she passed away. She was alone at that time. Our grandfather was gone when she moved in with us. She spent the entire day playing cards, sitting at the dining room table. We always were kidding her that she cheated herself, but she had doing that, and we never said one word to make her feel bad. She was a very pretty woman, even late in life. You could see how pretty she must have been. Our parents' father was extremely good-looking, tall, and thin. Arthur's email to Shirley. Nice, newsy letter. It reminded me of all the wonderful letters you wrote to me when I was in the service. They were appreciated at that time of my life. I remember most of what you wrote, but I have no memory of a raving beauty grandmother. She was a fat old lady with nice skin that cheated in a card game called Casino. The only problem was she hated to lose, so she did not think it was unethical to cheat. One time, my older cousin David Lynn wanted to make a point, and when the proper time came, he cheated and got caught. What a row. So I guess the point was only Bubby could cheat at cards, and since we were only grandchildren, whatever she did was okay. I have a vague memory of Zeta, but he does look good and great in those photos. Richard remembers. Although grandfather Mechel was always accused of being lazy, he was the one who got on the ship and came to America. If not for him, we might all be Russian. Getting back to our story, we have found the 1940 census for Molly and her third husband, Herman Lesk. She was 50 and he was 58. Our earlier records indicate that she was 52. They lived in an apartment in Brooklyn and had been there for at least past 5 years. Her education was listed as 5th grade, and since we know she left Russia at the age of about 20, she never went to school in America. This is the apartment at which Jimmy, Linda, and Enid Crease and Matt Lynn visited Udall and Molly as children, and is described later in this history. The 1940 census for Fay and Frank Blackman. The 1940 federal census finds Frank, 43, and Fay, 39, living at 114 East 24th Street, Brooklyn, just 2 blocks away from Perry and Sid. He was born in Connecticut and listed as a salesman of wholesale cotton goods. Their children are listed as Shirley and Dorothy, the twins we mentioned earlier. They are listed as 14 years of age. The 1940 census for Perry and Sadie Winston. 1940 finds them living in the house they bought in 1935. He is 48, a civil engineer with a salary of $9,000. The children, Arthur, 14, and Richard, 10, are listed along with a maid who comes from Pennsylvania. We found no census for Joe. Sometime in the 1940s, Mechel died. I remember his funeral. Grandmother made a huge fuss over wanting his coffin to be opened. It was a plain pine box covered by a talus. All of the adults refused. It was a bad scene. Grandmother moved in with Fay, as Shirley remembers it, and also lived with Molly and her third husband, Herman Lesk, as the Creases remember it. Maybe it was both. Herman attended Jimmy Crease's 1950 bar mitzvah with Molly. He began to develop Parkinson's by then. Enid's and Jim Crease's emails refer to fond memories of visiting them in Brooklyn. In February of 1950, Perry became severely depressed and attempted to take his own life. He was rescued from under a New York subway train by a Good Samaritan nurse, but suffered the loss of his legs. Over the next few years, he recovered, and he and Sadie traveled the world until his death in 1959. Ida died 3 months later in April or May of 1950. She never knew of Perry's problems. Richard remembers. After Ida died, Perry told me that she was prepared to go. She told him that when she got to heaven, they would ask her what she had done to deserve to get in. She would say that the family had a well in Russia, and she always let the travelers and strangers use it. Cousin Shirley's email. Everyone said that Zeta never did a day's work in his life. Bubby and him had a candy store someplace in Brooklyn. Bubby worked all day long on her feet all day, and he sat outside and only wanted to look great, but no work for him. My mother always stayed in touch with Enid, Bertha's daughter. Enid visited my mother with her children. Enid remembers. By the way, I absolutely loved reading Shirley's notes, especially the one that referenced our visits with her parents. We were with Melissa and Rebecca last weekend and asked them what they recalled from those visits. Both of them have vivid memories of Aunt Faye presenting them with little bags filled with old perfume bottles and pennies, treasures for little girls. For me, since there were many similarities between Aunt Faye and my grandma, Molly, the connection was important to me. Even the aroma of the lunch she always had ready for us was familiar. But I have to say, they were never blintzes. I remember being enthralled by going to Grandma's apartment, meaning Grandma Molly, in Brooklyn when the kitchen was wreathed in blintz crepes. Boy, were they delicious. I also remember playing operator with Cousin Johnny Lynn, using the wall phone that connected to the lobby. It hung just outside the kitchen. The kids were obviously easily entertained way back then. Jimmy Crease's memories. When I think of those wonderful times